Or warmly welcome you in the chilly winter in Kashmir. So, given the universally acknowledged importance of good quality and universal education in the overall well-being of an economy and society, it's true that governments need to be committed and proactive in ensuring relevant, robust policy frameworks and their adequate provisioning. India has now got its new education policy after roughly a gap of 35 years. And as far as today's conversation is concerned, in today's conversation, we'll engage with some crucial aspects of National Education Policy 2020. Of course, there has been a lot of debates after this draft came out and then the policy came out. So we'll be engaging with some issues which merit urgent attention. And for the information of the audiences, in particular, our focus shall be around the issues of higher education in the country. As far as the Indian higher education system is concerned, it's poised for a total reconfiguration if the proposed regulatory structure with support from various institutions is installed. Now, as far as the reform of the higher education sector, it's sort of since as far as the Indian higher education system, it's a huge system, and the reform is always a daunting challenge. It's a tough nut to crack because of the typicality of the university governance structure. So there is an uncertainty as to how the future will shape up among the global and national imperatives, and in fact how the entire higher education space have to negotiate with the post-pandemic era in the context of new global order. So for the discussion and all of this and many other things, we have today invited our distinguished speaker, Professor Srinivasa Rao, who is from prestigious Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Professor Rao is a professor of Sociology of Education from Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He has been the chairman of the, we call it head of the department for 2 years, and has served as the president of the Comparative Education Society of India for 2 years, a society which is doing a very commendable work, where a lot of discussion and conversation happens annually. Professor Rao is currently also regional editor, Indian Higher Education for Bloomsburg Publishing Digital Resource, Education and Child Studies. Professor Rao has more than 2 decades of experience at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and has the honor of being the managing editor of the Sage Journal for 5 years. We are extremely glad that Sir, out of his very busy schedule, and I have been requesting him for some time now, and I am very happy, and we are glad in our institution that finally he has got some time for us today. So I welcome him. And before Professor Rao will start his presentation, I would request our esteemed principal, Professor Malik, to kindly propose the formal welcome address to both distinguished speaker as well as the highly acclaimed participants of the webinar. Over to principal, sir.
Good morning to all of you, esteemed participants, academicians of different colleges, research scholars, colleagues, friends, and dear students. On behalf of IT College Bandipora, it is my privilege and pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this education for future. This lecture is being organized by the Department of Education of our college, and I really appreciate Dr. Manzoor Parey for organizing this event. Now, as far as the Bandipora is concerned, Bandipora is a district, and it is in the north of Kashmir, and it is nearly 55 kilometers from Srinagar. And this college is situated on a hilltop, some 6 kilometers from district headquarters Bandipora. We have some 3,000 students in the college.
This meeting is being
and
recorded.
this college This college is a NAC accredited B college, grade B college. And Bandipora has a history of its own. It was in prehistoric times, it was a gateway to Central Asia, connecting the link between the North India and the Central Asia via Silk Route. And this college, as I said, that it is located on a hilltop. It is surrounded by the mountains, and on the front view, we have the famous Waller Lake, which is the second largest freshwater lake in India. Now, as far as today's webinar is concerned, as we already know that Union Cabinet in July 2020 unveiled the new education policy NEP 2020 for the education sector, proposed sweeping transformational reforms in both school and higher educational systems. Now, these reforms look holistic, flexible, and they are going to promote multidisciplinary education with an increased focus on basic skills to make the life of a student more natural. And it is based on the 5 foundational pillars, which we call access, equity, quality, affordability, and accountability. And it is set to have the transformations in the system and to make the education more vibrant and transform India into a vibrant, knowledgeable knowledge society and global knowledge superpower. Now, this national education policy, as we are discussing it today, this includes the universalization up to the secondary level with 100% gross enrollment ratio by 2030, and bringing 2 crore out of school children back to the school through a mainstream by opening school system. Likewise, in the higher education system, with a gross enrollment ratio of 26.3, a target of 50% by 2035 has been set. The policy seeks to ramp up public investment in the education system from the current 4.6% of GDP to 6%. Now, in today's fast-paced world, where we are facing huge unemployment problems of youth, the key thrust of curriculum and pedagogy has to be on real understanding and learning and equipping the students with the key skills, besides creating holistic and well-rounded individuals. Now, if we go back to the history of our education, during the last 75 years of education, it has remained grounded on mark scoring in exams and rote learning, and it has caused immense damage. Now, as far as the human talent is concerned, there is a treasure present within all of us, our students, and our education system should be able to find it out. Talents in extracurricular activities, supports, arts, music are very much important. Now, if we see the education system in the West, both academics and extracurricular activities, they are given equal importance so that human talent can be spotted. The emphasis on concepts, ideas, innovations, research applications, and problem solving can make learning holistic, enjoyable, and engaging. The students have to be given open or free hand to decide about their life, education, career, and jobs. The new education policy envisages that every student coming out of school, college, is adept in at least one skill, having a report card, giving comprehensive report on his or her skills and capabilities instead of just marks. NEP 2020 is seen as significant milestone in the history of education of the country, as it includes the best educational practices taking place in education sectors around the world. And this includes everything holistic, multidimensional, experiential, inquiry driven, and it is learner centric, and imaginative. It is based on evidence, and it will develop scientific temperament, and along with that, it will carry the aesthetics, art, and culture. And there's an emphasis on creativity, innovation, and personality development than scoring marks. And there has been no separation between science, arts, extracurricular activities. Subjects like arts, music, crafts, vocational skills, supports, yoga, community services, and stuff will become part of curricula, and students can choose whatever they want. And in engineering colleges, for example, we can have music where the students who have talent on music, that can be exploited. The students can opt for subjects as diverse as mathematics and history. And it looks very ambitious and full of promises. But the question is whether we can implement it in our universities and colleges. There are academicians who are giving apprehensions that there could be the private sector will dominate the education sector. The multiple exit and entry points will increase the dropout rates. And then, of course, we have budgetary, these constraints, which was already, we were experiencing that the colleges and universities, they are facing infrastructural problems, dearth of faculty, etc. And to discuss all these things, ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have with us our guest speaker, Professor S. Srinivasa Rao, Professor of Sociology of Education, Zakir Hussain Center for Education Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Professor Rao is the right person to give us more perspective on these issues and how we are going to implement this policy. Professor Rao has published important research papers in journals and edited books published by reputed publishers and editors. He has written book chapters, journal articles. His teaching and research interests include diversity, equity, access, excellence in education, and mainly center around issues of sociology of education, sociology of marginalized, urban sociology, and policy sociology. He had been a part of joint collaborative project between Institution of Education, University of London, and Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies. He has received awards, fellowships, honors, and has been member of various academic committees associated with Contemporary Education Dialogue, Essay Journal of Educational Studies as its managing editor, and currently he's also working as regional editor, higher education for Bloomsbury Publishing Digital Resource Education and Childhood Studies, a web portal. I sincerely extend a very warm and cordial welcome to you, sir. Despite your tight schedule, you have been kind enough to spare time for this lecture. I hope that engagements and deliberations of participants during this lecture will certainly be fruitful and productive. Indeed, it is my pleasure to have all the participants with us this morning. Now I invite Professor Rao to take the floor and address all the participants. Thank you, sir.
Over to Professor Rao, sir. Sir, are you with us? There is some technical. Sir has lost the connection probably. Sir can join.
Yes, maybe he will join in a while.
All right.
Hello.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir has lost the connection.
I have a request. I will request all the participants to make this program very interactive and ask questions, because there are doubts present in every individual, every academician. I have recently attended a meeting at university, and people have not understood the national education policy, and we need to discuss it more and more so that the pros and cons come on the surface.
Yes, sir. Sir has joined in again.
So, yes, sir. Please. We had lost your connection, sir. Please go ahead.
Yeah, yeah.
Over to you, sir.
The connection is, yeah, I got disconnected actually. So
yes, sir.
At my end, actually, this got disconnected.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Mohammed Amin, Malik. I think your words have been and have given much needed foreground actually to this discussion. I must also thank Dr. Manzoor Parey for being persuasive actually to commit myself actually to this discussion. In fact, I was very impressed actually with Dr. Manzoor Parey's academic endeavors and commitment when I met him for the first time actually in JNU during orientation program, I think orientation or refresher program, which I was coordinating actually for the HRD Center. So I think ever since he has been in touch, and it's my pleasure actually to deliver this lecture to this august audience. Let me also actually say that NEP 2020 itself is a huge text, and it has multiple facets, even in terms of higher education. So I will try and see how best actually we can capture a kind of a spirit that it seeks to deliver, that it seeks to achieve, so that a kind of a future can be envisaged or envisioned. I think we all know that this is the third education policy ever since the independence in 1947. 1968, actually, we had a very brief and a very short policy statement. And then we had a very comprehensive policy in 1986, which took almost 6 years actually to even get onto the floor to the level of implementation in the form of the program of action in 1992. So, and in between, I think we have had several other occasions where we kind of toyed with various draft policies in 1978 and 1989. Actually, we were actually marching towards a policy, but I think even before the policy came, the government of the day fell, and therefore there was a kind of a gap. So it's actually obvious that whenever a new government comes into power, it actually tries to advance a policy, not just education policy, but different other kinds of policies. Generally, education policy is a part of the framework which it places before itself in terms of other policies, such as economic policy, industrial policy, the technology policy or science policy, or any of those actually kinds of policy frameworks, and education policy is one of those. So ever since actually the new government came into power in 2014, there has been actually an attempt to bring out a new and comprehensive education policy, and duly, I think, constituted a draft committee in 2015 or so, which actually came out with a draft report in 2016. And then there was a revision of that draft report in another couple of years. And then finally, we arrived at July 2020, when the country actually announced its education policy. That is actually what we are calling as NEP 2020. So therefore, in different, in all actually during this period of almost 75 years, we have had only 3 policies, though there were attempts actually at different points in history. What is actually interesting is that while the first policy was an outcome of a very elaborate evidence-based policy-making process, the subsequent policies of 1986 and 2020 have not been so much rooted in collection of the ground level data for the purposes of the education policy making. It actually, of course, relied on a wide variety of evidences which are produced by other agents, scholars, researchers, institutions. But I think for the purposes of the policy, there was no systematic and comprehensive attempt. Now, I think if you all remember in 1964, 66, Kothari Commission had a very huge mandate actually, and they collected huge bundles of data about what is the available infrastructure, the composition, the outcomes, and the processes of education system in the country. And then actually 1968, this policy was envisaged. So there is actually that kind of a process seemed to be missing in this policy frame. But I think it's also interesting that between 2015 and 2020, about 5-year period, there were more than, I think, about 2 drafts of NEP. I think it's not just merely a kind of skimming of the draft reports into a kind of a shorter versions, but I think there were certain kinds of missings also. I think, certain kinds of things were deleted or eliminated actually from the earlier drafts. So there is actually kind of churning that probably the government or the state engages itself actually within itself certain kinds of debates and discourses that actually make it a bit nuanced and make it more agreeable actually kind of draft. So what actually we will try and see is that and understand actually this kind of a policy making. I think any kind of a policy, let us actually be very clear, that is a policy in the making. It's not the final kind of a word on how the country will be governed in terms country will be govern its education system. So any policy for that matter is a work in progress. I think you all know that ever since actually the policy statement has been released, there have been attempts to prepare the implementation strategies. It is actually this is what makes actually this whole process kind of little ambiguous is that the statement that is given in the text of the policy translates into the actual practice through this implementation strategy. So while actually there is a kind of a grandeur that is presented in the text of the policy, that actually get into a kind of a fragmented and breakable points of implementation, and in that process not all aspects of policy can actually be translated into the implementable agendas for the government. So some will be left out, some will be picked up. And why actually some will be picked up and some are not picked up? Why actually some statements remain at the level of the visions and some actually, actually be processed? So there is actually a kind of a process which one needs to understand even before we understand the nuances of each of the kind of statements that are made around the higher education and its governance in India. So therefore, let us actually look at this whole process and actually see this policy. We must also understand that it's both a text and also action. It's not merely actually a text. It actually also suggests a certain kind of actions when it says that this is what it achieves, seeks to achieve, and what it intends to kind of put it into practice. So, but how that practice will shape ultimately will be left to the implementation part of the story. So, and it's not actually merely the words. It also actually therefore particular kinds of deeds, and it is what is enacted as well as what is intended, and so that the country provides certain kind of a vision for the future. It's not merely talking about a very short-term kind of impact or short-term kind of outcomes or the effects of the policy. It is intended for building a kind of a society which the current ruling establishment thinks what it wants to achieve as a society, because higher education is a very important element in the process of development, in the process of the making of the nation, the making of a kind of a society which is based, which actually gives preeminence actually to the values of the values enshrined in the Constitution. The values of equality, values of social justice, values of fairness, all those actually kinds of values are set to be achieved through this policy. And it's actually more important for us as a student of sociology, when we look at the role of higher education, we always feel that higher education has a bigger agenda in the society, in the sense that it changes or transforms the structure of the society. So if you look at the contribution of higher education, historically, it actually seeks to transform not merely the economic or a kind of a occupational structure of the society, it also seeks to change the way we think, the way we actually kind of conceive certain kind of ideas, or put actually certain ideas into some useful, progressive kind of futures. So therefore, I think it's important actually for us to examine the policy in its entirety, in terms of actually the spirit it tries to achieve, the kind of agendas it sets in front of the nation and its people, and in terms of actually how it seeks to build what is called the future of the nation. If you actually look at, when the country had been actually, higher education in this country has been elitist, we all know about it. It was very urban centric. It continues to be urban centric. It continues to be kind of, slightly, advantaged towards the privileged, towards the middle classes, and therefore it actually purports to advance the values of these sections primarily. But one change that has occurred during the past 2 decades in the post-2000s is that it is moving towards a kind of a mass-oriented higher education system. It hasn't really reached the mass levels of, if I may use the Martin Tro's classification of societies based on the gross enrollment ratios in higher education. Martin Tro actually is a sociologist who actually kind of a variant by theoretical commitment. Actually, he looks at the countries moving towards a kind of a mass-oriented higher education, where the gross enrollment ratios reach beyond, say, 50% of the gross enrollment ratios. Gross enrollment ratio of higher education is nothing but the composition of those who are enrolled in higher education in the age group, relevant age group of 18 to 23 years, which is expected to be in the colleges when they are in this particular age group. So that means only if you look at the 2019 statistics, about 27% of the youth in the age group of 18 to 23 are only in higher education. That means more than about 73% are outside of higher education. So therefore, I think the policy had a kind of a context in front of it. While if you look at the other countries all over the world, United States has something like 70% odd actually gross enrollment ratios. Some countries even have almost 80% of, I think they move towards not just the mass higher education, but they are universalizing higher education. So they reach actually about 90% to kind of call themselves as having universal higher education. But compared to this, and compared to where we were in 2006 or 7, in 2006 or 7, UGC, has conducted multiple studies on the gross enrollment ratios, in which it was found that only 7 to 8% gross enrollment ratio was found. Actually, at the level of 7 to 8% of gross enrollment ratios, the country is highly elitist. That only few privileged, people could enter into the portals of higher education, be it colleges or universities. So I think slowly we are moving towards the mass higher education. If you look at that, I think, but this mass higher education, moving towards the mass higher education, treats different social groups differently, different geographies differently. In some geographies, for example, I think you take Sikkim. Sikkim has more than 60% of gross enrollment ratio, which is almost actually a kind of a mass oriented higher education system. And you take the other states like Bihar and UP, you will find actually that it's much more to be desired. And if you take the gross enrollment ratio of the tribes, it's still at 18%. Scheduled caste, something like 22-23%. Women, I think, seem to be doing better actually, in India compared to the men, because women seem to have registered slightly higher, 1 percentage point higher than men in terms of gross enrollment ratios in 2019. So if you go by the recent statistics, the recent statistic is only about 2019. So therefore, this is the kind of context in which this policy emerges. This is actually the kind of background, and therefore we also have a kind of international pressures of kind of providing universal higher education, or widening actually participation in higher education. We have already had certain commitments in school education which have put pressure on the higher education system to deliver, to be ready to induct more and more students emerging out of schools for admission in colleges and universities. So the priorities in school education in the post 1991 reforms had triggered actually massive expansion. Obviously, the demand actually was placed on the system of higher education. So higher education had to respond to these kind of bulging numbers who are seeking their admission into the colleges and universities. So we had actually to respond, and therefore we have seen certain kinds of institutional and new institutions coming up in the first decade of the new millennium. We had actually several of these institutions coming up, but I think that is not sufficient. And at the same time, you find another process happening, since the government is unable to fulfill or provide institutional infrastructure to induct a large mass of students entering into the portals of higher education. It actually almost forfeited its privilege to the private sector. And what actually the ultimate consequence is that today the private sector dominates the provisioning of higher education in the country. So this is actually the kind of backdrop within which we are actually trying to understand the policy and its meanings and its attempts actually to create a kind of a future. Let me also place right now actually that the text is one thing, but there is another side to the policy, that is policy emerges as discourse. No, actually when it actually is seen as a discourse, what we actually mean is that there is a kind of a social agency or social intentionality around. So that means actually as actors, we make a meaning, we tend to kind of be influential, we contest, we construct, we respond, and we deal with lots of these contradictions, and we actually try to espouse certain kinds of contradictions and representations of the policy. So therefore, actually, as Foucault actually mentioned, that discourses are practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. So it's actually it's the kind of objects we tend to sort of build through these discourses. These discourses actually are very, very essential. And that is what actually when Professor Amin Malik Saab had mentioned, that there are many, many discourses and many, many voices actually which speak differently about the NEP 2020. No, the way it is construed actually, obviously has its own connotations. to the specific kind of individuals or scholars or groups actually which are talking about this NEP 2020. So they are about what can be said and thought, but also who can speak, when, where, and with what authority. So they embody particular kinds of meanings, in particular kinds of contexts. So what I actually tend to bring into this discourse is my own understanding of what it actually seeks to kind of project and what it seems to kind of achieve and how. So this is actually what we will try and see. But actually, it's also kind of, whenever we talk about the link between the policy and the future orientations, we also need to understand how policy is seen as effect also. It actually can also be looked at from the point of view of different kinds of effects it has. And if you want to understand this impact of the policy on the effects it intends to achieve, we need to really talk about two different kinds of effects. One is that the first order effects. These first order effects are the immediate kind of practices which are put in place to achieve a particular goal stated in the NEP 2020. And the second order are the consequences of the first order effects, an impact actually of these changes on the patterns of what you call the social access, opportunities, or social justice. So different kinds of things. I think ultimately any policy is expected to provide equal access. It must actually provide education of good quality. It must provide actually a kind of opportunities for everybody, and it also actually must ensure that there is a kind of a provisioning of social justice and fairness. So I think if you specifically look at it, actually I'll try and organize this in terms of actually different steps that the policy itself actually makes. Most importantly, if you look at the policy and its vision, it's very, very kind of lofty, I must say. It has actually all the contradictions. And as such, actually, we must agree that in general, any policy is supposed to be a set of contradictions. Because the state itself and the state actors themselves have internal contradictions as to what to weigh in favor of, what to weigh against certain kinds of formulations. And what emerges as a text, policy text, is a kind of a negotiated kind of a text. So therefore, when you look at the text and the vision it actually seeks to advance in the initial pages itself, then you find that several of those we find actually very, very paradoxical and contradictory. One is actually that it talks about transformation of India. It talks about sustainability, equitable and vibrant knowledge society. It wants to kind of provide high quality education, make India a knowledge global superpower. It wants to kind of enhance a sense of respect towards constitutional values. It wants to develop deep-rooted pride in being Indian. And it wants to root itself in the Indian ethos. It is committed to the human rights. And ultimately, it wants to make what it calls a global human, global citizen. So if you look at this, I think the rootedness in Indian and actually making of a global citizen, can they be achieved simultaneously with the same kind of content? How do we really deliver on producing the Indianness when the country itself is hugely diverse. The diversity that the country presents itself, in that sense, how do we really call what we call as Indian ethos? And at the same time, what do we mean by global citizenship? Is it actually, does it mean only producing, workforce for the rest of the world? Or do we also bring in the universal global values which are predominant actually in many advanced democracies in this country, in the world? So do we actually mean that, or how do we actually eliminate the tensions that may arise when we simultaneously want to achieve the Indianness and of being global citizen? So therefore, I think if actually these values are placed in the vision itself, the rest of the implementation or implementable practices that the policy is going to come out with henceforth, already I think you must have seen several of the specific formulations have begun to emerge. You must have already seen that Academic Bank of Credits has already been notified as a gazette. You must have already seen a draft National Higher Education Qualifications Framework actually has already been, draft has been put in the public domain for comments from the public. And we already have, has this, the choice-based curriculum in place. So different kinds of steps towards the implementation of the policy have already begun. And there's actually many more newer steps actually will be brought out by the regulatory bodies like UGC, AICTE, or what actually has been envisaged as a unified body of control in higher education. A National Research Foundation. I think a number of those kinds of things I think will slowly become a part of, and they'll probably take the institutional. What it actually means is that in spite of these steps, which the policy has envisaged and are taking shape in the form of the implementable ideas, the core actually value system that the policy envisions is also very, very crucial. Actually, for example, on the one hand, it talks about kind of enhancing the values of constitutional, values. And at the same time, it seeks to control what is to be taught and what is not to be taught, how to be taught. Certain ideas of the curricula are always contested. And if you have seen actually the recent regulation or circular of the UGC, which talks about that eliminating certain kinds of topics, elimination of certain kinds of lessons or themes, which are probably not doing well. I think, this is the process of what it actually calls as rationalization. We all have seen actually what rationalization of school education has, produced. And we are now into an era where higher education is also being rationalized. Rationalization actually in school education, I've done a study of 3 states in India, Odisha, Telangana, and Rajasthan, of how rationalization of teacher-student ratios created a situation where a large number of rural schools, remote area schools, schools in tribal areas have begun to be shut down. So there's a a real crisis of access to the social groups, access to education for the social groups which have been historically deprived of education. I think if we begin to rationalize even higher education in terms of the student-teacher ratios, I think this also about teacher-student ratios, we have seen a newer kind of circular. Very recent, actually. These are the steps which are taking place in the backdrop of the policy. And they have actually emerged only a few weeks ago. The moment actually the rationalization of teacher-student ratios begin to emerge, the problem actually may not be so much with the urban centers. The problem may be actually with the provision of higher education in the remote areas, the hilly areas, or the areas where the tribal populations live. Or it actually may be detrimental to sometimes the government educational institutions, because many of these government educational institutions themselves have lost enrollments, kind of reduced enrollments, reduced emphasis on certain kinds of courses, no takers actually for certain kinds of courses, and therefore those courses, those colleges may actually face a serious consequence of closure. It's also actually important actually to look at actually if you look at the larger aims of higher education, not actually just the vision. It actually rightly points out that higher education has a very important role in promoting human as well as societal well-being, and in developing goals and values enshrined in the Constitution of India. And actually, it lists a few values such as democratic, just, socially conscious, cultured, and humane kind of nation it wants to build, which will uphold liberty, equality, fraternity, and justice for all. I think it's nothing but actually it's reiterating the constitutional preamble. And this is what actually it wants to achieve in the future. Just as any policy of the state would actually talk about these values. It also actually kind of, the contradiction there actually is that on the one hand, we want to commit ourselves to the constitutional values like this, but on the other hand, we begin to debate, discuss, and enforce sometimes the validity of certain kinds of curricula, certain kinds of events. What is happening in down south is also a kind of a consequence, or a certain kind of a contradiction that we see in terms of the policy and how the kind of how the states intervene or don't intervene in certain kinds of promotion of values, which may be kind of enshrined in the Constitution. The aim of the higher education also is expected to be kind of bring in a good quality higher education system. But what it means by good quality higher education is not very, very clear. What actually one can get out of the policy document is that quality higher education must aim to develop good, thoughtful, well-rounded, cultured, and creative individuals. So any kind of education is expected to do these things. Don't you agree with me or not? So what is so new about this proposition? If it is to a good quality higher education is to make good, thoughtful, well-rounded, cultured, and creative individuals, what do we consider as good? What do we consider as cultured may have actually different kinds of meanings. And this is where policy text as discourse is important. On the one hand, actually, the discourse seeks to formulate a certain kind of idea of good quality. Good quality is not what, in terms of actually most of us think good quality higher education or good quality education is. That we tend to kind of communicate with our students in a much more engaging and meaningful manner, by which actually our students actually get to benefit. And they become actually, what we communicate and what we transmit within the classrooms is of some use when they get out of the institutions. I think if you say that IITs are of good quality institutions, in what sense actually are they good quality institutions? Is it actually in terms of these kinds of qualities like good, thoughtful, well-rounded, cultured? Or is it in terms of the instrumental value the quality higher education seems to offer? So I think this is another kind of a contradiction in what it actually seeks to kind of achieve in the future. What I'm actually, one need not actually be very, very kind of microscopic. But I think the task of a critical analyst is to go deeper into the words, go deeper into the meanings behind those words, so that I think we can place. And it's very important, I think, at another place, it actually also talks about developing character, ethical values, intellectual curiosity, scientific temper, spirit of service, different other kinds of things. How do we really achieve these things? When we, on the other hand, actually move towards the entirely different set of frameworks which focus merely on outcomes. If the students do not achieve this course, achieve the pass out rates from the colleges and universities, then that actually college is said to be of not good quality. The college actually may be transmitting good values, what may be actually called as good, may be transmitting constitutional values, but that actually seem to be not considered as good. Rather, actually, there are counterattacks on the institutions which seem to be transmitting those kinds of values. So, of course, actually, as Professor Amin also has, Amin Malik Sahab actually has also mentioned, that the idea of education is to make students holistic, that holistic and rounded individuals. So therefore, I think, but kind of that well-rounding is enjoined by a phrase called with a definite skills sets. Now, what does it mean? Holistic is seen in relation to the kind of a skilled, identified skill sets. And it does not actually clearly mention about what are those skills which are identified. But it actually says in connection with that, holistic means actually that higher education shall develop what this NEP calls an identified set of skills and values, which it says shall be incorporated in each stage of learning from preschool to higher education. So ultimately, I think it comes down to imparting the skills. There's a huge stress on vocationalization and imparting skills. That means I think the utility dimension or instrumental dimension taking preeminent position in the overall scheme of the vision for higher education. Now, why does that actually happen? It happens because higher education is seen to be serving the market. It is not visualized as serving the society at large. We need to actually make these distinctions between the society and the market. And if you, I think this is nothing new actually. See, it's not, we cannot really blame this policy alone. We have seen in the year 2001, I think, there was a high-level prime ministerial committee, Birla Ambani committee. You know, that time itself, they spoke about the market orientation. Higher education must be market oriented. There is actually kind of a mismatch between what industry wants and what higher education systems seem to be producing. And therefore, it actually raises the questions of relevance of higher education. Why is this higher education? Is it not for industry? Is it not for the markets? If it is for the markets, let actually the industry get involved with how higher education should be shaped. So therefore, it is not the academics, it is not the societal representatives which matter in the planning and execution of the higher education, but it is the market representatives who become actually important in this whole story of relevance of higher education to the society. Society in that sense actually is a kind of a, synonymous with the market. So therefore, I think the skills are for, but the state itself actually seem to be taking a backseat in terms of generation of employment, and therefore market is supposed to be generating the employment opportunities, and that probably may mean actually that what the higher education should respond to what the market wants, what the industry wants. But in that, obviously, is in contradiction with what the NEP 2020 seemed to be envisaging in terms of multidisciplinarity. You have certain kinds of disciplines which seem to be relevant for the markets. A large chunk of higher education seem to be not responding to the market demands. And how do we kind of look at so I think this kind of a mismatch, obviously, we have seen in the neoliberal environments. No matter what, the social sciences and humanities take a beating. They are not preferred. They slowly kind of wither away. But in that sense, I think NEP 2020 seemed to be providing a ray of hope for the humanities and social sciences, where it actually seems to be stressing on multidisciplinarity even in the single subject institutions. That means I think IITs will no more be centers of engineering and technology. They'll also be, having multidisciplinary subjects of study. Maybe I think it really comprehensively transforms the ecosystem of higher education. Agricultural universities will not become merely agricultural universities. They will also actually have the liberal arts, humanities, languages, all actually disciplines, art, dance, everything. So there is actually a kind of a contradiction. On the one hand, a vision actually which seeks to promote the instrumentality of higher education system. And on the other, you have a vision of creating a multidisciplinary focus. And that actually probably, I think this is how probably the NEP 2020 seem to be making or producing cultured, productive, socially conscious, holistic kind of individuals out of churn out actually these individuals from higher education system. So it actually does list all the existing problems, and it also comes out with, and these problems are very real. I think there cannot be any disagreement over, all the problems it tries to list out. That the higher education system is highly fragmented, that there is less emphasis on cognitive skills and learning outcomes, that there has been rigid separation of disciplines with early specialization and streaming of students into narrow areas of study. But I think, somewhere I think this idea of specialization is the hallmark of the progressive kind of societies. Society, as this society advances, the society becomes more and more specialized. There is a natural tendency for the societies to come out with deeper specializations within specializations. It doesn't merely occur in sciences. It also, or the medical, disciplines, medicine or engineering. It happens actually across the disciplines. As the numbers increase, as the complexities increase, as the kind of, size increase, and which has been the case actually in the society. And therefore, the specialization is a hallmark. And how do we deal with this natural tendency of the society to develop increasing division of labor, which actually asks for higher specializations with denouncing actually the specialization? It actually, the policy criticizes the specializations. You may not actually have, I think within a particular discipline of education or sociology, or economics, any discipline for that matter, we'll only be talking about one small area. We cannot actually take the whole area to be our specialization. And that actually is a very serious concern. As the knowledge progresses, it actually tends to go deeper and deeper into the minute microcosm of the issues, so that I think, you have solution. So even in science, we are entering into nano dimension of every discipline, whether it is biology, physics, chemistry, anything, nano dimensions. So that actually calls for higher and higher specializations. We need to create these, these kinds of avenues for even further and further specializations. But on the other hand, actually, if you look at its criticism of the deeper specialization as a problem, I think needs to be kind of probably reframed or re-looked at actually in that sense. So therefore, I think, there are very interesting kind of problems. It does acknowledge the lack of avenues for higher education in remote areas. And at the same time, actually, on the other hand, as I mentioned, the policies that it seems to be envisaging subsequently seem to be disadvantaging those remote areas themselves. So in such a context of higher education scenario, the NEP 2020 envisions a complete overhaul of the higher education system. Of course, actually, it does mention that equity and inclusion are its guiding principles. And there are multiple other kinds of, it talks about a number of other, in terms of governance. It's not merely in terms of access, but in terms of how the governance structures are to be looked at. It talks about the autonomy of faculty and autonomy of institutions. What does that mean? Actually, we don't know. In spite of actually autonomy being talked about for the past 2 decades, did our institutions, did the faculty got the autonomy they are asking for? And what does that actually autonomy mean? Or is that autonomy also circumscribed within a particular kind of a governmentality? So what I teach is also being questioned. Slowly, I think how I teach will also be questioned. And therefore, a teacher may not be independent entity or autonomous entity. And the institutions are not. I think even if you are given grade 1 or grade A, you are not actually autonomous. Ultimately, UGC prevails over you. On the one hand, you are given all kinds of powers to create your own curriculum, your own admission procedures, generation of resources, and at the same time, you are curtailed by certain kind of dictates of minimum standards, which actually the institutions are expected to follow. So the recruitment of teachers is not complete. The financial regulations are not kind of completely free for the institutions. Even actually the student intakes are not free for the institutions to adopt. The admissions actually are to be within a particular kind of centralized framework. It's going to be a centralized framework. Now, institutions cannot innovate. So actually this also kind of contradicts with what we call a kind of diversity that the policies are expected to kind of, achieve. Finally, I think, there are multiple other kinds of issues which we can go on talking about. As a way of conclusion, I'll place before you that these are the basic tensions which are embedded in the NEP 2020. And these actually tensions or contradictions or paradoxes are both structural and are played out at micro political level. So therefore, on the one hand, the centralized authorities provide a grand vision. The local structures tend to interpret them in different ways, which probably contradicts the overall framing of the policy itself. And this also occurs because there are diverging kinds of interests. One is actually the interest of the state, which is largely driven by the capital accumulation and the logic of economic efficiency. It actually intends to kind of build the capital so that actually country can advance. And at the same time, actually, there is a logic the capital puts forward in terms of the efficiency. And whenever you bring in the logic of efficiency, the higher education system actually, tends to move towards the privatization. Private is seen as more efficient. Government is seen as less efficient or kind of less useful and less actually kind of in terms of delivering outcomes. And therefore actually the logic of economic efficiency, rationalization, which I spoke about, tend to kind of take the system of higher education towards the privatization and I see this is not actually a kind of a future orientation. It's already happening in front of us. It's already kind of it's already at play. So therefore, and actually we also have seen what are the outcomes of that indiscriminate privatization as well. If you take engineering education in India, more than 90% of the institutions are in the private sector. And if you look at the southern states in particular, many of the private colleges are asking for closure because there are not many, they're not delivering. It's not merely that economic efficiency logic seem to be applied even to the private sector. So there is no common argument against the government institutions. The privatization experience of the past 2 decades tells us that the private is also inefficient. And there are different layers of the private. There are different hierarchies of the private. And a large mass of institutions are struggling to sort of, but actually the problem lies when the state becomes a partner in that privatization process, as we have seen in many states, particularly in the states of South India, particularly Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. We have seen that huge amount of social welfare funding has gone into the support to the private colleges in the name of supporting the SC, ST, OBC students in those states. In the kind of, supporting the private sector, private college education of the SC, ST, OBC students, the money that is earmarked for social welfare at large was actually, siphoned off to the colleges and universities in the form of what is called the fee reimbursement schemes. These fee reimbursement schemes are nothing but plundering the public money to kind of, make the private colleges and universities function. So these are kind of a whole lot of nexus which we can see between the state institutions, the private and the market, and actually the whole kind of, consequences which are already there in front of us. So I think we can go on talking about these kinds of. The second actually most important kind of point, I think, is that on the one hand, this market operates. On the other hand, the tension is actually of what we may call, what we may designate as social order. Now, how the political class in ruling envisages what actually it calls as social order, stability, authority, and how it wants to achieve these through education. And according to them, actually, certain kinds of ethos are crucial in building actually that social order. And that is where we need to understand the neo-conservative reformist or reformativism, actually, as what Stephen Ball talks about, neo-conservative reformatism, creeps into the policy-making process. Therefore, I think some of the contradictions in NEP 2020 in higher education present before us actually those kinds of contradictions. On the one hand, it wants to become global, Vishwaguru, and on the other hand, actually it wants to address the local, the kind of deep-rooted Indianness, deep-rooted Indian ethos. Whereas actually ethos themselves actually are diverse. And the third actually dimension along, why actually these kinds of contradictions emerge is because of the contradictions in the technical and managerial capacities of the state itself. And these actually include the issues of governance, issues of control, issues of costs, issues of planning. So therefore, I think if you look at all these dimensions, I think this what we have got, what we have in front of us as NEP 2020 and its prescription for higher education, we only actually can understand why this is. And therefore, I think, in sum, what we see as tensions, like to the past practices and values, global knowledge, superpower, and the measures of localization through vernacularization of higher education. The talk of autonomy versus the centralization and over-regulation. The discourse, unresolved discourse of private versus public. And kind of not so clear framing of quality versus access and equity, and ambiguous kind of references to privatization and commercialization. It also talks about stopping the commercialization. But what does that mean? In the first place, education cannot be a kind of a private good in India. If it is actually, it is nothing but commercialization. It then actually has to be checked. Are we able to check so far? We have actually had not just these 6-7 years, but I think we have had a history of commercialization of higher education for more than 30 years. It talks about marketization, not directly so much, but in terms of making higher education systems student-centric. Entire higher education systems seem to be focused on the student centrism. That means actually the demand centrism. If the students want something, actually that has to be delivered. And this is actually one of the important aspects of marketization. So we need to kind of look at that dimension as well. And we also finally, we also look at how it seeks to homogenize, and it also kind of, vis-a-vis the kind of diversities that are already there existing in the society. So you have these multiple kinds of, kind of binaries actually, or dualities that are there in front of us. So amidst what Habermas calls as inflation of expectations, which is actually highly kind of increasing day by day about this NEP 2020, we need to be brought to the ground to see the real effectiveness of these policy statements and their implementability. Thank you so much, and I invite any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for a very thought-provoking lecture. I'm sure the audience must have actually loved the kind of words you have put in. I'm sure every one of us has some understanding of the new national education policy, but seeing from a critical perspective, it was, and as a teachers in higher education, it's also important, as a scholars in higher education, it's important that we need to have a nuanced understanding of any policy, whichever government it comes from. And we also must be, as an important stakeholders, it's also important that we should have an eye how these policies are being framed and how they will be implemented, what is in the store for these policies. And also, as far as private, for example, the policy of anything private is good and everything public is bad, we should also see that there are private institutions which are not Shivnadras and Ashokas of India, which are situated in NCRs. There are which are equal quality or even bad quality than the public institutions. So as an academicians, it's our responsibility to have an eye on all of these things. I thank you, sir, for your wonderful conversation. I invite, if there are some questions, the audience can raise their hand and they can directly have a brief introduction, and you can have. In the meantime, we have some questions in the chat box. Mushtaq Saab has asked some questions. For example, he says that very good afternoon, sir, you're good self. Sir, as per NEP 22 in envisaged